So first of all, good afternoon and welcome, or welcome back to those of you who have joined us for the second week running. This is, of course, the second webinar in a series of 3 on CIWEM Chartership. So today we're again joined by Alistair Mosley, Hannah Coogan, and Mo Syed on our panel. And the focus for this second of 3 sessions is going to be the A and B competencies. As before, we're going to start with a presentation from Alistair to take us through the basics, followed by a Q&A for the panel. If you need to leave at any point during the webinar, the recording will be made available on the CIWEM YouTube page, which you can also find through the CIWEM website. And at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A button. So please do ask away throughout the presentation, just as and when the questions come up, and we will be sure to address them at the end directly on air, if you will, during the Q&A session. That's all the housekeeping done. So with that, Alistair, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So welcome everybody to this afternoon's part of 3-part session on the CIWEM Mandatory Competencies. Little background to me, I'm Alistair Mosley. I've been a member of CIWEM for getting on for 25 years, I think it is now. I'm a fellow of the institution and I'm chartered with CIWEM Engineering Council, Chartered Engineer and Chartered Environmentalist. Very proud to be a fellow of CIWEM and fellow of the ICE. And over my years, I've done lots of work with people to bring them forward, as either mentoring them or assessing their applications or interviewing them. So I've got quite a bit of experience, and I'm going to share some of that knowledge with you now on the CIWEM A and B competencies. Now, if you were with us last week, you will have seen that we went through the career overview report and an overview of the process and the things you can take into account. This week, we're now going to start looking at the competencies in detail. Now, there are 14 competencies and they're split into 5 groups. So this week, we've chosen to do A and B. And then next week, the final one of the 3 sessions, we're going to look at the C, D, and E competencies. So today, I'm going to take you through what the mandatory competencies are, what they mean in their overall context. And then we're going to drill down into the A competencies first, as you would expect. There are 2 of these, A1 and A2. And then I'm also going to give a brief overview of the other registrations. So I just mentioned to you there that I'm a Chartered Engineer and Chartered Environmentalist. I'm not a Chartered Scientist, but one of our panellists is. So you might want to ask some questions on that as well later on. There isn't time to do all of the competencies in detail to the other registrations today, so I'm going to just focus on Chartered Engineer and Chartered Environmentalist, just to show how they relate to the CIWEM competencies. And apologies to the scientists out there for CSci. I do have a slide pack on CSci, which I will be prepared to share with you if you ask for it. So just drop a note back to Stefan on that one. So we'll then drop onto the B competencies, what they aim to achieve. There's 4 of these. And again, I'll take a quick look at the Chartered Engineer and Chartered Environmentalist competencies to show you how they compare or contrast. So without further ado, I'm going to go and talk about the competencies themselves. So what are they? We use this term really to describe a person's ability. And CIWEM has chosen to create 14 competence areas that we think naturally demonstrate professional practice, management and interpersonal skills that we think are considered common to and necessary for chartership. These are the things that define the whole professional, if you like. They're actually life values in many ways, and I think that hopefully that will transpire as we go through the competencies one by one. As I said earlier, we've grouped them into 5 areas that broadly encapsulate all of the qualities of a professional person. And what we really mean by competence here is the ability to perform a task or a role required in an area of responsibility. That's a very important word, that responsibility. To be chartered, you have to be holding responsible positions to be taken seriously as a professional. And to an expected standard in your area of work or specialism, without supervision. Again, without supervision is the important phrase there. So what do we mean by professional standards? Well, if you chose a scale of from 0 to 5, 0 would be being not aware. It may be the level you might be at when you go to university to start with, and you've decided you want to do a course, but you don't really know an awful lot about the subject matter. You then, through education and experience, you become more aware of these things and hopefully become curious about them. So you want to learn more. Level 2, once you're aware of something and you've developed some form of skill in it, you're then able to assist a competent professional in delivering that particular area. And eventually you get to a point when you're working under supervision, but you're still delegated a certain amount of leeway in how you're going to deliver that, but you'll be supervised. At professional level, chartership level, we are looking to see how you are at operating at level 4. This is competent. And there's that phrase I mentioned earlier, without supervision. And we're looking for you to be able to go out into the wider world and represent the institution independently with confidence, based upon the experience that you've had to date, without supervision, and being able to deliver knowledge and expertise that people can then use and value. Obviously, the next stage is to be an expert. I don't personally believe there's any such thing as an expert. An expert is just somebody that knows a little bit more than everybody else. Because in truth, we can always learn, which is why we have continuing professional development. Because we're recognising that there's always something we can learn from. And just to represent this graphically, this is what we're trying to achieve: experience and training. Chartership is an experiential learning qualification. It is a qualification. You could say it's the university of life in a way. You've had the formal study at university. What happens now is you then gain experience. And what we're doing is measuring that experience through these 14 competencies. So the 5 competency groups, let's look at all 5, and we're going to focus only on the first 2 today, remember. So the first ones are looking at existing and emerging factors influencing the environment and water issues. So this is about knowing the wider context of why we do things, not just doing the job blindly because we believe that we're excited about that particular activity and not realising why. So it's understanding the context of why we do the work that we do. The B competencies are very much about how you do your day job. So they show there to demonstrate that you're able to plan, implement and evaluate work. Okay. C competencies, which we're going to go on to next week, are about safe and effective working practices. They also embrace quality and sustainability, as you'll see next week. The D competencies are about your ability to communicate as a professional and your adherence to professional ethics and understanding of the importance of those. And the final set of competencies that we have are the E competencies, which are all about your commitment to your professional development and then, as you might expect, your commitment to the work that CIWEM does. So just looking now through the A competencies, what do they aim to achieve? Now, these are the ones that very often catch people out, actually, because they don't know really what we're looking for. So I'm hoping that today I will give you a few tips and things to think about to what you can include in your A competencies. What they're not about is writing about the work that you do. It's about you as a professional and your interest in the things that influence the work that you do. And also your ability and to recognise and react to change. Now, CIWEM has 2 levels of change in its competencies. The A2 competence looks at change in the wider context, in the case of, for instance, a change in regulation or a new government directive. And then our B3 competence, which you're going to see in a little bit, is about change on a project level. So they're not the same. So it's amazing how many people get those 2 confused. So the kind of things we're looking for in the A competencies are your ability, your knowledge of existing and emerging factors influencing environmental and water issues. A classic one there would be, of course, the fact we're in Brexit and we're going to be breaking away from the European environmental regulations and the kind of implications that will have for the sector. Understanding the environmental and sustainability factors that influence the work that you and your employers do. So a classic one there would be like working within the remit of the Water Framework Directive, or if you're in the water industry, it would be known that you're delivering new CSOs because you're trying to meet the urban bathing water standards. Okay. Water and environmental affairs beyond the scope of your work is also something we like to test. We like to see that you understand what's going on around the world. There's been some classic things recently, like the terrible fires that were happening in Australia, the reducing ice caps that are really in the news at the moment, and dropping a really recent one in yesterday, the microplastics research that's going on, and these microfibers that they're finding in the top 1 or 2 meters of our oceans, which have been really revealing. So those are the kind of things that we want you to show to us that you're interested in. We need you to show that you've got the knowledge of and understand that you can adapt to changes brought about by government. Okay, so I mentioned that already, and there are going to be quite a lot of those coming up soon. So those of you that think of you doing applications later this year and next year, there's probably quite a lot that may well have an impact on the work that you do, and also the changing climate and the global activity that we need to overcome it. Finally, we need you to demonstrate your own personal commitment to the environment and sustainability challenges that the world faces. So that's your commitment to recycling. You may have an electric car, you may have solar panels on your roof, you may have been doing car sharing, your commitment to video conferencing. All of that would fit very neatly under the A competencies. So very briefly, just dipping into them in detail. I think I may have jumped the gun slightly on this, so I may be already repeating myself. Look at the A1 competencies. A1 is the one that most people have the most trouble with, okay, as I said earlier, because they can't quite pair apart this, showing that you understand the wider impact of understanding about the environment till you're doing your day job. So this is about you as an individual, not about the projects that you do. When we get into the B competencies in a minute, you'll see that they are about the projects that you do. But A is about you as an individual and what you know and of what is driving the work that you do. So I've already covered some of those items there, but you can see them later. But other things you might want to introduce is any knowledge you have of new technologies that are coming in that are going to have an impact on water and environmental management. And also, this is a good one too. Many people work for companies and they don't always know about what that company does elsewhere. So a lot of you will be working with big consultancies who've probably got activities going on all around the world, for instance. So we'd like you to be able to show in here that you are aware of some of the environmental challenges that your company may be facing. The fact that it's doing that around the world, for instance. The environmental regulations in America are very different to what we have here, for instance. So that's the kind of stuff that you could have in your A1 competence. Very important, this one. You must show that you've got an understanding of current local, national and global environmental issues. This one's a really good one when you go for your PRI, actually, because very much when you go for your professional review, if you're able to drop out the fact that you've seen and read about a very current issue, is something that the reviewers will find engaging. And what it's telling us is that you are a well-rounded professional that really cares about the work that you do, and that you're not content just to keep plodding on sort of blindly. You're showing that you know the context of why you're doing your work. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the A2 competencies are about changes in your sector. So these aren't changes on your projects. These are changes at a high level that are having an impact on what you do. And it could be new legislation, for instance. If you've obviously just heard today that the Public Health England is now getting rebranded into some other form, that's something that's going to have a big impact on the people that work for that organisation. That kind of change is the sort of thing that will have a big impact on what you do in whatever walk of life you are, and you need to recognise that those things are happening and be able to tell us about them. Usually when something has changed at a high level, you then have to adapt to that change. So this competence is also asking you to tell us what strategies you put in place, what plans did you put in place so that you were able to address them in your work. So, and that can be either at your level in how you're delivering your work to adapt to that change, or the work that you might be doing with your employer to do that. And one of the ones where we find a good one is for those working in the development sector, when expectations on allowances for climate change will come in. That can have a big impact on what you do. That's the kind of change we're thinking about. And how the work that you do around this change has helped your company to achieve its strategy going forward. So not all of us have the luxury of that. So the place I would focus on is at 1 and 2 on this list. Understanding what the challenges are and then being able to adapt the way that you work to meet the requirements of those challenges. Things that we often like to see, if you have been lucky enough, if you've been in charge of a department perhaps, and you may have introduced a new standard, a system or service. If you have, tell us about it. And any actions or initiatives that you've developed and implemented that have then been adopted by other members of your organisation. Those are things we like to know about. So the broad context of the A2 competence is recognising there are changes and finding ways to overcome those changes in the work that you do, either personally or for your company or for the people around you that you work with. Happy to take some questions on that a bit later on. If somebody would like to put some examples forward, then we can perhaps critique that. Now, just very quickly, just so that you know, I'm not going to spend much time on this. Chartered Engineer and Chartered Environmentalist competencies still carry the letter A, but they're actually quite different. They're still focusing on this wider knowledge, but they are very different in context. So what I'm really saying here is you can't just read across your CIWEM A competencies to the Chartered Engineer or the Chartered Environmentalist. So, but what you can do is you can adapt what you've written, but it's really, really important that you fully understand the context of the competence. So the CEng A competence is about maintaining a sound and theoretical approach for around new and advancing technology. So it's very much a forward, which you expect engineers to be really always looking ahead at the new things that they can bring in to help them do their work better. And the A2 competence is showing that you can engage in creative and innovative development of engineering technology. So you can see A1 very much fits with CIWEM A1 in as much as about knowing about the things that are happening around you. And A2 is about, in its own way, about change. But the A2 competencies here are looking at how you might engage in introducing creative and innovative technology into the work that you do in continuous improvement. And the CM ones, of which there are 3 CEnv competencies, the first one probably does match quite well with CIWEM's A1, underpinning knowledge of sustainability principles. But the point here is this question, that word sustainability is important. You really need to understand what sustainability means. It's not just about environmental good practice. It's about sustainability in its entirety, which is the 3 pillars, which is environment, economy, and society. So show that you've got an underpinning knowledge of those principles. The A2, of course, is about applying knowledge and principles in pursuit of these. So you could argue A2 is an extension of A1. And A3 is being able to analyse and evaluate problems from an environmental perspective. Very much aligns with our B2, to be honest. There's a bit of an opportunity there. I think in my first set of slides, if you see them from last week, you will see there are some little map crosses to show how they interrelate. So perhaps go back to that. So with eye on the time, I'm going to rattle through the B competencies now. So the B competencies are very much about you doing your day job, okay? So it's your ability to analyse a problem rather not to just treat the symptom. Being able to develop options to those problems. People very often get them mixed up actually, and we end up with options being presented in B1, but actually all we're looking for in B1 is to show that you can actually identify the root cause. B2 is about how you develop the options. B3 is about how you adapt to change. All projects change. I can't think of any project I've ever worked on that didn't change at some point, and it's just showing that you're still able to deliver on the expectations of that project, even though you've had to adapt the way you're going to deliver it. And of course, B4 is about if you've created something, does it work? Okay, evaluating the performance of projects or management decisions. That's what we're looking for in the B competencies. So quickly rattling through B1, as I said, it's about understanding what the problem was. This is important. What research or investigation did you carry out to find out what that problem was? That could be if you're a sewer modeler. That would include instigating a flow survey, for instance, to try and identify where the ingress of water was happening in the system and where the flooding problems were. What were the main factors that needed to be considered investigating the problem? They could be asset capacity, they could be environmental impacts, they could be community impact. Anything like that is what we're looking for there. And we also want to know who the stakeholders were, okay? And how you ensure that the nature and extent of the problem was fully understood. The B2 competencies, as I said, are about evaluating the options. So what we don't want in life is to only ever have one option. it's really good to, if somebody's investing in us overcoming a problem, it's good to be able to give them some options. And what we want to know is, what were the basis of the options that you provided? Was it around cost? Was it around environmental protection? Was it around minimising community disruptions? We want to know what the drivers were that you used to make that recommendation. We need to see that you've used sound environmental and engineering principles, if we're in an engineering context there, to identify the issues through specific examples. I should also have said this, as I said with A1 and A2, A1 and A2 are about you and your sort of work within the working environment. The B competencies are about jobs. So in the B competencies, we want to see real examples. Okay, and I think I may have referred to this last week. We don't want, ideally, we don't just one example appearing all the time. My recommendation to you all is to have a suite of about 2 or 3 project examples or management examples that you work with, and then to use one, lead with one on every competence, and then supplement it with one of the other 2 every time. So we don't just see the same example coming up over and over again. Although I have to say, the time when that perhaps isn't so important is on B1 and B2, which are very much interlinked. So B1, you might have a project that's where you've identified the problem, and B2 will be then what the options were. So it's perfectly acceptable, I think, for B1 and B2 to lead with the same example. But it's always good just to have another one in reserve, just to really make the point of how experienced you are in this particular competence. We also want to know, even in B2, the evaluation that you undertook and the criteria you used to arrive at the options that you're presenting. So we don't want you just clutching at straws. We want to know some proper reasoned thought behind what you did. And your approach to comparing widely different options. And I think I said that right at the beginning, showing that you are able to show the criteria that you've judged the options against. And the final part of this is then, how did you present them? Were you presenting to stakeholder groups? Were you presenting to a board, management teams, investors? So we want to know about what the context was of that. B3 competencies, as I said, are reacting to change. All projects change at some point. So we want to know when that change happened, what were your options, and what was threatening the success of the solution or its delivery as a result of the change. More than often, it's about delivering on time. That's the biggest one, always going to cost more. But equally, it may be a greater environmental impact or a greater community impact. So those are the kind of things that we want to see here. And then, what did you do? Well, how did you plan for the introduction of that change and then to overcome it? And the very first thing when a change happens is you usually need to notify people, like the people that are investing in it, so that they know what the risks are of what the risks to them are as investors. How did you resolve the problems, and also how did you deal with any contractual risk? This is a really important one, actually. Many of us will have changes and will be employing subconsultants, subcontractors. They will be on contracts. So when something changes, what measures were there in the contract to make sure that they weren't able to take you to the cleaners, for a start off, and equally you can look after their needs appropriately as well under the contract. And finally, how did you ensure that budgets and sustainability criteria were met in spite of the change? And the B4 competencies, this is about seeing whether it worked or not. So we want to know how you implemented the solution and you managed it, what the main issues were that affected its implementation, and then how did you manage the performance and make sure that it worked at the end of it. Okay, that's the kind of key message to come out of that. And if it didn't achieve what was expected, what were the corrective actions that you took? One thing I often say here when I'm advising people, a B4 competence is perfectly satisfied by a failure as well as a success. So if you built something and it didn't work, that's fine. Tell us about it and tell us why it didn't work and what lessons you learned from it. So don't be afraid of talking about failures in these competencies. It isn't all about fantastic success and accolades. It's showing that you can learn from things that didn't go as well as expected. And the final part of my presentation today now is just quickly looking at how the Chartered Engineer competencies and the Chartered Environmental competencies map across to these CEwem ones. So again, they're in the context of delivering a work. For CEng, there's only the 3 competencies this time, B1, B2, B3. and they're about applying appropriate theoretical and practical methods to the analysis and solution of engineering problems. In the CEng B competencies, we really need you to show us that you are thinking and working like an engineer, which is not necessarily the same as working as a water environmental manager. So we are going to see some sort of technical understanding of the work that you've been doing. So if it's a hydraulic solution, we need you to show that you understand hydraulic performance, for instance. If it's got structural elements to it, we need you to tell us that you know how it'll stand up and what some of those structural criteria are. We're not asking you to do detailed design here. We're asking you to show us that you have the engineering understanding. A classical one, I'll give as an example, was we had a lady present to us a few years ago, and she'd been doing some natural flood risk management schemes, and she had quite a lot of dams in there to hold the flow back. Now, that's all very well and good, but some of them were quite deep. And she was looking to be a chartered engineer, we needed her to tell us what were the stability criteria of those dams to ensure there was no further breach. So that's a good example there. So the B1 competencies are about identifying the potential projects and opportunities. So this is the sort of engineering criteria that you use to introduce a project. What research you undertook to make sure that the engineering solution was going to be viable, that's B2. And then B3, showing how you can manage the implementation of the design solution and evaluate its effectiveness, okay, but from an engineering context. And the CEM competencies, I think this is my last slide now. Again, there are 3 of these, and they are very different. So the CEnv B1, which is about doing the day job, but it's showing that in your day job, how do you promote behavioural and cultural change, particularly influencing others to secure environmental improvements that go beyond minimum statutory requirements. We don't want box tickers as chartered environmentalists. We want people that will actually make sure that we nurture and protect our environment. B2, promoting a strategic environmental approach. As you know, whenever you approach any project, there is a strategic theme running through these things, and CEnv is testing your understanding of how do you adhere to great environmental principles in the promotion of the projects that you're working on. And the final one is demonstrating leadership and management skills, but actually in the context of sustainability. So it's showing how you are adhering to good sustainability principles in the way that you lead and manage and deliver projects. So there we go. That was a very fast trot through the A and B competencies with a quick overview of the chartered engineer and chartered environmental competencies. Quite a lot to take in there. I'm hoping that stimulated some questions, and I'm looking forward to answering them along with my colleagues on the panel. So please fire away.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. That was very comprehensive. So as we go through the questions, it might be useful if you have them to hand to just have all the A and B competencies on the screen, or we can flick back and forth through your presentation perhaps. I'll
reshare them, okay?
Yeah, just in case anybody's not familiar with the exact wording, for example. Yeah. So also, we have now had Jonathan Bush join us on the panel as well whilst you were presenting. So Jonathan is the past chair of the West Midlands CIWEM group, or the West Midlands branch. He's got over 40 years of experience in the water sector, initially as a process scientist with a master's in water management. Spent the second half of his career as in international business development and due diligence and investment in UK water companies, and he's currently also a mentor for the potable water CIWEM e-learning course. So a wealth of experience there as well, alongside our other panel members. So moving on then to the Q&A, I see we've already had a question or two come in, and we will answer those in due course. So first of all then, for the CEwem competency A1, the first one we talked about, and the one, Alistair, which you mentioned, is one that people tend to struggle with the most. It's all about awareness, right? So yeah. How do you recommend, or how do you personally keep up with the latest sector developments in your particular sector, Alistair?
Okay. Well, first and foremost, within the sphere of operation that I work in, I know I've made it my business to find out what are the things that are influencing the area I work in. So I'm sure whoever's asking the question, which company you work for, you should have visibility of. For instance, the most obvious one is how your industry is regulated. So, for instance, if you're working for a water company or you're working in the water industry, we would expect you to show that you understand that the water industry is regulated in England by Ofwat, England and Wales by Ofwat, and in Scotland by the Water Industry Commission. So we'd expect you to know that. If you're in an environmental context, we'd expect you to know that we've got the Environment Agency in England, and we've got Natural Resources Wales, and we've got SEPA up in Scotland, and then obviously on Northern Ireland as well with their own regulator. So that's kind of a good starting point. Understand how your sector is regulated and be able to describe that. Understand what legislation you're delivering things to. I mentioned the Urban Wastewater Bathing Directive. Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. Get my wires crossed there. Is a good one, and obviously that's going to change as well going forward into post-Brexit. So that's something you might want to reflect on in A2. So understanding the legislation that affects what you do, and then obviously wider affairs. Just generally, you should be keeping news feeds on what's going on around the world. Read a good quality paper. I often say this, if people don't like it, if your political leanings aren't this way, The Guardian is really, really good on environmental affairs. CIWEM has a really good website, so just keep an eye on the website. We've got the climate emergency, which you'll see when you go on there. It's all of that, really. And it's as I said, it's not about the projects that you're working on or the areas you're managing. It's understanding the things that are influencing what you do.
Okay, yeah. Jonathan, you've perhaps got a bit of relevant experience there as well. Do you have any other pointers that Alistair maybe hasn't mentioned on keeping up to date with latest developments?
I've always kept up to date, taking advantage of all the free sites and magazines that you can link onto. Wastewater technology, for example. Isle Utilities are currently doing free webinars. There's quite a lot out there, surprising amount out there. And if you do it in a disciplined way and keep a record on that, correct me if I'm wrong, Alistair, but you can bundle this research together. They can count towards your CDP. But of course, if you're rather light and hearted about that, be aware that you could be asked about it in your interview. So, but if you're serious about it, it's a good way of getting information about the water companies, other water companies. And of course, I mean, I'm bound to plug the West Midlands branch. Before the pandemic, it was a good platform for networking in person, finding out where mentors may be, and of course, attending events which can go towards your CDP. But even now, there's no reason why you shouldn't email people in CIWEM and ask if they can be potential mentors, or indeed to ask about specifics, specific areas. So read, just because you are specializing in an area doesn't mean to say you shouldn't read around it as much as possible. As Alistair said, new innovations are coming in all the time. Facebook, for example, there was one about Redditch. No, it was on LinkedIn about the Severn Trent research area at Redditch and platforming a number of process technologies there. So there's plenty out there if you just browse around, and the more you browse, the better you get at it.
Yeah, good point. And I think we had a question last week or 2 weeks ago, sorry, about mentorship as well. And just to reiterate again, the West Midlands branch, if you are in the West Midlands, is a really good port of call, obviously, if you are after mentorship or advice in general.
Can I just add something to what Jonathan said there? It's just really, really good, Jonathan. Thanks for that. There are some really good free, yes, they are free, online things. There's Water Briefing, is worth watching. I know ENVs is obviously a fantastic journal for people in the environment sector. I don't know whether that's free or got news feeds, but it's being connected to those groups and showing that you know, being connected to them and see what's coming in and absorb it, and then be able to repeat it back in this competence.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and moving on then, I have at times heard the suggestion that when going for CWEM, it makes sense to try and hit CSci and CEnv as well. For an engineer, you may add CEng to that. And Alistair, you touched on this to a degree already, but do you think it makes sense to try and tick them all off at once? And Mo, I know you are chartered more or less across the board there, so maybe you can tell us a bit about how you went about getting chartered across the various disciplines.
First and foremost, as you said, it's quite demanding. There's subtle changes, and if you do together all of them in one go, you need to understand one thing, that the perspective that Alistair was highlighting several times. So can you switch your brain if you do all together? And number two, ask yourself honestly, I don't know about the participants' experience, why you are attending today, after how many years, or how many of these you have attended before. So if you cannot manage one, how can you manage four? Ask yourself, ask some hard question. Really, are you in a position to put that effort? I did serious effort. And thankfully I was helped by my employer as well. So they allowed me to take, actually realistically I couldn't do it on my own time. In theory you can do it. So I came into an arrangement where every week I used to spend 2 hours work time. I would do the work lunchtime another day. So they allowed me certain, so I made some realistic arrangement in plan and then went on about it. So my point is, ask yourself, like, I don't know where you stand and what effort you have done so far to achieve your chartership and what you are going to change and realistically how much you can achieve.
Mm-hmm. Yes, anyone else want to add to that?
I'll just chip in very briefly on that one. So Mo's absolutely right. It's don't underestimate how hard it is to do them all at the same time. It's in a way it's easy to do them at the same time because you're filling them all in together. But actually, what I just said there is they're all the same. So if you want to go for charterships, as Mo has done, it's very impressive there. You've got to bear in mind you are essentially going to be filling in well over 30 odd competencies because they're not the same. So they're similar, but they're not the same. And so the first question to ask is, do I need it? Being chartered is being chartered. Chartered is CIWEM. If your company needs you to be chartered, the chartership, in terms of what the scope, is exactly the same as all the other charterships. If you need to be chartered to show that you're professional, CEwem, stay with that. If for some reason you need to demonstrate to clients or to customers that you have that engineering qualification, or environmental or scientific qualification, then by all means, then think about doing those as well. But first and foremost, ask yourself why you need that chartership. And yes, you can apply for them later. So you could go for C.WEM, for instance, and CEng now, and then you could come back for CEnv or CSci at a future date. There would be a cost to that, of course, but actually, rather than fear failure, I would personally recommend you do that. Be prepared to come back to pick up the other registrations when you need them.
One thing I want to add, probably Alistair in a better position to answer. I think if you go for more than one, you can pass one and fail other one, but you need to pass CWM mandatory.
Absolutely right, yeah. You can't go in and fail CWEM and get CEng. You have to get CWEM, and then we then consider whether you're suitable for the other registration.
Okay. Thank you. And I think we've had a somewhat related question from the audience. Can you apply directly for dual fellowship with CIWEM and the IWA, as well as a chartered and water and environmental manager, CEwem? Now, I think in CIWEM terms, fellowship is a very specific thing that Hannah can tell you all about. But I think the crux of the question there, and please correct me if I've interpreted it incorrectly, is can you go for chartership with CIWEM and the IWA directly at the same time?
On the IWA, well, I'm just slightly getting wise because we are exploring a relationship with the IWA. I don't know whether that's actually formalised yet. Does anybody know on the panel?
Yeah, I think it's formalised. So I applied to be a member. I'm chartered, and actually I did this before I got my fellowship last year. I applied to be a member of the IWA, which actually bizarrely saved me £15 a year on my membership subs. So everybody should do it. I think you'd have to look on the CIWEM website, but that was quite straightforward to just fill in a simple form, I think, saying you want to be a member of the IWA. I'm not sure about the question about any kind of chartered status the IWA confers, or any fellowship status. You'd probably need to ask CIWEM HQ directly, because it's quite a specialist question. Okay,
so if we haven't answered your question, please do get back in touch if that's still outstanding.
Just to come in there, just so it is clear though, you can apply to be a fellow of CIWEM when you're going, so you can apply directly to be a fellow. So if you think you're ready, you're not chartered yet, you've got the experience, you're holding that position of some sort of a notable position or a position of some influence, that's what we look for, then you can apply to be a fellow at the same time as your C.WEM. It isn't actually the same process. Your fellowship is assessed by a different team to the ones that assess you for C.WEM, but it is all done at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. Moving on to the B competencies, and you touched on this briefly last week. The B competencies broadly follow a sort of standard project lifecycle. How does someone in a, call it business as usual role, go about identifying examples that are relevant and sort of substantive enough?
Okay. Shall I lead on that, or Hannah, you look, you're going to say
yeah, I can maybe sort of thinking about my local government days, and I have mentored people in local government and the Environment Agency through Chartership before, all of whom were in that position actually, that unlike where I work now in consultancy, where almost everything is project-based, things there were more about service delivery. And I would say just take a step back and think about that. And, what is a project? It's about identifying something that you need to do and what you need to do to get there, and scoping that out. And actually service delivery is not that different, and there are changes over time to how you deliver services. And some of these things, so let's just talk. I'm very pleased, Alistair, you've got the B competencies up. Let's just talk through these quickly for a minute. So being able to analyse a problem, understand the cause and not just the symptoms. Ideal example here, say that you're working for a local authority or the Environment Agency, you've had a flooding incident, you've gone in to investigate it. How did you talk to the community? How did you talk to the other risk management authorities? How did you understand what was not only what were the consequences of that flooding, but what was the cause of that flooding? And then let's just play with that example for a minute and let's just move that forward. So then we have that, I'll go with that same example. So we've had a village that's been, say, badly flooded. And then we want to be able to say, well, what could we do to address that issue? And then in come lots of interesting things here, and you could start to think, well, there's different options there, but what are the things that really help you whittle down the realistic options? So, where would you get funding from, for example? Are you working in an area of any significant environmental constraints? So when I was flood manager at Staffordshire County Council, we had an SAC near Lichfield. We had to think about very carefully in water quality terms for one of our catchments. And, and if you are in a frontline role, actually societal benefits are really easy to think about, because you are working frontline with communities that are affected by environmental challenges. So actually you could work it through, say, an example like that around where are there options. Let's move on to the third one and think of a different example. So being able to adapt to change and still deliver to meet expectations. So let's say that we are working in the Environment Agency or lead local flood authority, and we're answering planning consultations as a statutory consultee. Now, anyone who's involved in planning will be aware of the 2 government white papers that are out there. And that might be something to sort of demonstrate maybe for A2. That's a wider change affecting the industry we'll need to think about. But say there's, maybe a smaller change that happens. So let's say that we're working with councils and the councils change their consultation process, or a developer submits a flood assessment, you've looked at it, and then they submit changes last minute, but you've still got to meet the same timescales to get back to the planning authority. That might be an example of a change you could demonstrate there, in terms of, because that in effect is a mini project. You are responding to a planning application, a bit like you were doing a flood investigation, or you're doing a flood alleviation scheme. A lot of these things that we think of as service delivery, we can break down into mini projects. And then the last one, I would say, you know, evaluating performance of projects or management decisions. So being able to implement solutions and monitor them. Actually, anybody delivering a service, this is really key. How do you monitor how that service is going? You think about things such as key performance indicators. You will have a way of monitoring what you do. You will work with managers to report performance. And that's not necessarily in terms of how did you do individually responding to something. It's collectively, how are we meeting our targets for responding to something? Collectively, how are we delivering the 6-year flood alleviation programme? How are we reporting to regional flood and coastal committees? There will be elements there of delivering a service that are fundamentally about monitoring how that service is going, and where things are maybe not going as well as you'd like, or where there has been a change, you will have had to implement something. So just quickly, somewhere I've been talking for about 5 minutes now. When the planning consultee role came into the Lead Local Flood Authority at Staffordshire in 2015, we clearly had to change our service there, you know, and I led the council through that change. We had to recruit, we had to come up with new ways of working with district councils, lots of different things, and then we had to think about how we managed and monitored how that service went over time, working with the district councils. So you may have a similar example to that you could use. Hopefully that helps, because I'm aware I've been talking for about 5 minutes, but I don't know if there's anything further you want me to say on that, Stefan.
Nothing further I've got to answer that, but thank you for that. Any other members of the panel want to add to that? I think it's great. I mean, in essence, what we're saying here is, you know, even if you have a business as usual role, there are elements of that role in any case that you just need to identify really and put your finger on it. And again, it's one of those where when you start to talk it through with someone, it will likely become a lot more apparent as well. So that's where a mentor is hugely helpful.
And I would go back to what I said a couple of weeks ago, is that before you start going through the competencies one by one with your mentor, hopefully you've done a little bit of thinking about them before you get to that conversation, but spend, you know, 20 minutes, half an hour having a conversation with the mentor and tell them everything you do, even if you don't think it's not relevant. Because when I've had that conversation with people and then I've gone to say, oh, what have you started in the competencies? Let's look at them. I said, oh, you could use this, you could use that. And it hadn't occurred to them to think about it in that way. So I think that's how a mentor can really help you as well to form those responses. Yeah.
Okay. And again, looking at B competencies then, another question kind of related to this project life cycle view. You wouldn't ordinarily expect an individual to be delivering a project on their own. Have you got any advice on how to really effectively highlight your own contribution to that project without kind of overstating your involvement in the work that was actually delivered? And that's a question to any of the panelists, really, if you've got a particular view on that.
Well, the first thing to remember is, as I said in that earlier slide, we're looking to see that you can operate independently without supervision. Okay, so if you are in a project team and you are really just delivering what someone else is telling you, then you might not be ready to be chartered. So you have to have got yourself into a position where you have a position of some responsibility, where you're accountable for something and somebody is relying on you to deliver that without having to be supervised. That's the first and foremost thing. Now, very often on large projects are a bit like the old how do you eat an elephant in small chunks? There are lots of little bits, and you will be in charge of a little bit, even though you're delivering to the overall whole. A example would be HS2, where there are, there'll be thousands of different project components within that. And that's how you talk about you. You talk about how you've led to develop that piece of work within the context of the overall thing, of the overall delivery. It is really as simple as that.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments on that?
I was going to say something very similar to Alistair, actually. And the main thing is be honest, and recognise, are you ready to go for a chartership? And if you are, you must use the word, this is where you get to be quite self-indulgent, really. You must use the words, I did this, not we did this. And be aware that anything you put in your competencies, you could be questioned at in the professional review interview. So if you didn't really get involved, then don't say that you did, because if you could be sitting across the table from someone who says, "Oh, tell me more about that," and it's only going to trip you up later down the line. And actually, there are several windows now for applying for chartership, and every organisation will have some form of annual review, appraisal, objective setting. And actually, if you look at it and you think, actually, there's 3 more areas I need to work on, speak to your team leader, take the opportunity, and work with them to find those opportunities to help you get to that point you're ready to apply.
Just want to add here, right, what Hannah said is, if you are not confident in 1 or 2, you can identify. I know my first mentor, he got chartered. He was doing flood risk assessment job, river modeling and flood risk development, flood risk assessment. So he had hardly any experience of health and safety. So he used to go in a demolition site in lunchtime for 6 months to address that issue, and he had that arrangement. So there are always innovative ways, and don't rely on years of experience, because someone have 10 years of experience. It could be 1 year experience 10 times. And so it's not about how many years, what you have done exactly. And of course, you have to be honest. Unfortunately, if you are not involved with responsibility, you shouldn't claim it. It will be tripped. It will be found out in various stages. And last thing is, you may not deliver the whole project cycle. Say for me, I used to do SMP work before I have my current role. So there are so many. We used to develop a model. We did flow monitoring planning, then flow monitoring itself executing, and then identifying where, and before that even, where the model is weak, we need to improve the model. So all these small elements, some elements you do with authority, you are the person without any assistance and supervision. That itself can be a project. Like, so you don't need to do from A to Z. One element, you should demonstrate that I've done it with competence, with understanding, and then build on that.
Yep. Thank you, Mo. Okay, and then in the last 5 minutes, one last question for the panel, unless we've got any more coming in from the audience. I wanted to pick up on one specific competency, which is CEnv B3. It's interesting because it specifically refers to leadership and management, and generally we say that level of seniority is not directly associated with your being qualified for chartership. So why do you think it's worded that way, and do you think that line management is a requirement for that particular competency? Alistair?
You don't have to be a line manager to be a leader. So don't get them confused. It's just showing, B3 is just showing that you took the initiative, and that you took something forward, and that you then were able then to manage it and package it up and deliver it. It's exactly as Hannah was just describing in some of the other examples she gave. And then, as I was trying to say, you may only have a small part within a big machine, but that small part is really important. And in that small part, you will have to have demonstrated leadership to actually deliver what you're going to do, because without leadership, things don't happen. So that's what B3 is trying to measure. It's not saying you've got to be a company director or a senior manager. It's just showing leadership within the context of what you did to actually deliver something, and the management skill that you applied to do that. And then for CEng, it's particularly around bearing in mind sustainability principles.
Yeah. Okay. All makes sense. Thank you very much. So we haven't got any more questions from the audience at this point. So what we'll do there is we'll go ahead and draw to a close now. We're nearly at the end of the allotted hour anyways. Just again, a reminder that the recording of this session today is going up on the CIWEM YouTube page, and this was the second of 3 sessions. So if we haven't covered some of the competencies that you have questions about, join us again in 2 weeks' time. That is the 2nd of September, I believe. On the Wednesday again, lunchtime session, and we'll be going through competencies C, D, and E as well. So all that's left for me to do then is say thank you to our 4 panelists, and I hope to see many of you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.